Hello and welcome to Never Read Alone, a show about reading with other people. I am here with my friend and co-host Bob Baxley. Hi, Bob. How you doing?
I'm good, Scott. How are you? I
I
see
am
Kevin
good. I
Flores
am
just
good.
joined. I'm excited about that.
Yes, very exciting. We have our Kevin. Welcome to the show. Now you're helping us not read alone because Bob and I feel lonely when we're talking to each other. We need a third person to make us feel validated. So thank you, Kevin, for being here. So the format of the show is really simple. It's an idea that Baxley came up with a small group of friends to read an essay every week together. And I thought it was such an amazing, fun, and inspirational idea or experience that I suggested to Bob, why not invite other people to join us? And we talked about it, and he chose an essay that we're going to talk about today, which I guess I should let you, Bob, talk about how you chose it and why.
Well, so I wanted to do something that was sort of relevant to the current moment around AI. And since Scott and I both come from sort of the design world and are known kind of in that group, I wanted to find something that would be interesting to people that already knew us. And so I looked at a variety of essays kind of around questions of technology. And I didn't want to focus just on exactly where we are today. I wanted to go back and look at some of the historical record. And this particular essay by Vannevar Bush, as we may think, is just a standout that is referenced all the time. It's just such a seminal work in projecting where things were going to go with the internet, the miniaturization of data storage, the problem of information overload. He does, and we're going to talk about this. He ends up theorizing a particular machine called the Mimex machine to deal with this stuff. But I think he's starting to already grapple in 1945 when the essay came out. He's already starting to grapple with some of the big philosophical challenges we're facing today.
So,
And
oh, God.
well, I was going to say, and personally, I found it interesting to go back in the historical record and try to find these writers who could perceive that technology was starting to work its way into all these different corners of the world and of society. We are so baked in technology that we can't imagine the world without it. It's just the water we're swimming in. So if you go back, in this case, to Vannevar Bush in 1945, but also if you go back to Norman Mailer writing of A Fire on the Moon in 1969, even Bob Newhart with some of his comedy routines in the late 60s, early 70s, they're starting to understand how technology is working its way into society. And it's just a really interesting vantage point to dig into to help us better understand the relationship between we as humans and what's happening with technology, which obviously is a particularly salient issue right now as we all try to start to understand what's really the difference between us and machines in an era of generative AI.
So did you read the essay before this read? Have you read it? Why did you read
Oh
it?
yeah,
You
yeah,
read it
yeah.
before.
No,
Why did you read it then?
I'm not sure how I actually don't really recall how I got turned on to it. I don't,
Okay.
but I probably read it like 5, 7, 10, maybe 10 years ago. I think I've read it a couple of times. I reference it for people all the time. It's one of a handful of essays, many of which come from the Atlantic magazine, actually. So it's one of a handful of essays that I send around quite a bit. And lots of, you can find lots of people talking about this essay. It's not like I'm the only person that's noticed this particular one,
Yeah. Yeah, my history with this essay is I studied computer science in college, and we did a fair amount of history stuff. We read Turing's essays and
Yeah.
a lot of stuff. So we read this, and it's also an essay that gets referenced a lot by other pioneers for the web. So people like Doug Engelbart, who
Yeah.
did the mother of all demos, where he demoed and his research lab basically invented the mouse and word processing. And then the guy who invented Xanadu, Ted Nelson, who
Yep.
coined the term hypertext.
Yep.
So I was familiar from school, and then I worked on web browsers. So this essay gets linked all the time to that history as this pivotal delivery of ideas that got reused by people who basically invented the modern technological world. I don't know that I ever read the whole thing. I knew of it. And then when I read through it this time, I had a very different experience from what I remembered. So a good place to start, Bob and I came up with some questions to anchor us in reading together. And the first question that we have is, what kind of essay is this? How would you characterize this essay?
Well, I think at the beginning of the essay, he's identifying a problem, which we'll get into it more. But in summary, I think it's information overload. And
Mm-hmm.
then he starts to theorize a mechanistic way that we could deal with information overload to continue to expand the scientific enterprise. So I guess I would call it kind of a visionary
Yeah,
essay.
I would
Um,
agree with that.
it's almost like a policy paper.
Yeah.
A little bit like I think it's a little bit like Kennedy's moon speech, except that he's not as specific because it's not like the machine that he proposes is not as specific and near term as the Saturn V and the Apollo lander type stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's a similar kind of arc.
Yeah, yeah. Part of the context here, I knew a little bit of the context. I knew he worked in the government. I knew he was pivotal in developing the
Oh,
National Science Foundation. He was like a
yeah, yeah.
pioneer
No, he more than worked in
administrator.
the government. Yeah, yeah. So
Right, right,
he
but
was a
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say he was the guy that worked in the Roosevelt administration that was responsible for animating American industry to join the war effort. Because the United States has a long-term history of public-private partnerships for building all sorts of things. Our entire defense system is built on public-private partnerships, telecoms, public transportation, all that stuff is public-private relationships. And it goes back to the Revolution, the Civil War, everything else. And so FDR brought Vannevar Bush into the administration to try to animate all these, or motivate all these companies to join. And then Vannevar Bush also, if I have the history right, he's the guy that got that convinced Fred Terman to come out and join the staff at Stanford. And Terman was the one that kind of implanted the idea that Stanford should be a university that builds companies. And so Vannevar Bush is also like just a seminal figure in the history and development of Silicon Valley.
He is. He is. Where I was going to go was that about what this essay is if you read the essay today and don't know the context of who he was in 1945, I don't think it reads that great. I think it reads kind of dry and a little bit nerdy. But when you know who he was, that he was this pivotal figure in World War II for defining how technology would help America win the war. And he worked for FDR. And he did all the stuff that wasn't just being an engineer. He was like a pushy, kind of like LaGuardia, like a really pushy kind of guy to achieve all these things. And then he's writing this essay as the war is ending about, so to me, it's very much a vision essay. And I think the reason why the Atlantic was willing to publish it has more to do with who he was than what is in this essay or not. That he was really this key guy for explaining science. And then his opening thing to me is about, he's worried about what scientists are going to do.
Right.
He's a little nervous. We taught these people how to build landmines. Like we taught these people how to like kill other people. I think he has some consternation about that. He wants them to find a new direction that's a bit better for the world, I think.
Yeah, well, I think it's useful to highlight that it's in 1945 at the close of the war when you're going to have all these people coming back from the war and the country's gotten all this energy and industry and built up all this capacity. It's been pointed in one direction, and now that direction's gone. So, like, what are we going to do now? A little fun fact. So he was also he was involved in the Manhattan Project. And if you saw the movie Oppenheimer, his character's played by Matthew Modine, who appears at various kind of quiet moments in the movie. But Vannevar Bush was part of the Manhattan Project as well. Not as a scientist, again, sort of as a champion of science. I also think you have to think about where the country was in 1945. Like, we were very excited about technology. Like, we were doing all sorts of amazing new things and new machines. And that is something that got started probably by the 19 teens. I mean, you think about the enthusiasm around shipbuilding, like with the Titanic, and then you come out of World War II and you're right on the verge of creating jet airplanes. You've got aircraft carriers, you've got incredible flying machines. If you think about, comparing a P-51 in 1944 to a Sopwith Camel coming out of, 1922, that's just like, that's only 20 years. Like, that is just, like, we can't even imagine that kind of progress in aviation, for example, over the course of 20 years, like, because aviation hasn't moved in 50 years.
Yeah.
So I think you're just at an inflection point with technology that's very different than how we think about technology today.
Yeah. This might be a good point for us to talk about. So we've talked a little bit about our opinion of the essay, just very briefly, and you're more favorable about it than I am. So I don't know, maybe you should tell me what excites you about rereading this, and then I can tell you what I didn't like about it, and we can see where we go.
Well, so I think at the beginning of the essay, I'm just looking at my notes here, and it was interesting trying to pull quotes from it because almost all my quotes are entire paragraphs.
Yeah, that's part of my problem.
Yeah. Well, I sort of have this thing, different writers write at different levels of granularity. So some writers write at the level of paragraphs, and some write at the level of sentences, and some write at the level of bullet points. And Vannevar Bush is definitely working at the level of paragraphs. And so if I'm just looking, and for those of you who haven't read it yet, the essay is very clearly divided into 8 different sections. They are appropriately titled Section 1, Section 2, Section 3, etc. There is no subtitle to the
Pretty
sections,
inventive there.
but there are definitely themes to each section. And the first section, what he's really talking about is that the amount of knowledge that people are producing has just exploded in recent years. And so you've got all these specialists, and they're amassing enormous amounts of knowledge, and we're still storing it in books and journals that go in libraries. And you have to be able to get to the library. You have to be able to pull the physical copy down. You have to be able to reproduce the physical copy. There's just a lot of logistical challenges around how do you manage this enormous amount of knowledge. And so I think that's really the catalyst for him wanting to write something like this, is we have all these scientists who want to continue to build on the scientific project and continue to build up our mountain of knowledge. But how do you do that when the mechanisms of the knowledge are getting just overwhelming, right? I mean, just imagine, take the whole internet and imagine it's not the internet. Imagine it's in a library and you have to go to the library. You have to go from shelf to shelf to shelf to look things up. It's just incredibly laborious.
Yeah.
And it would dramatically slow down discovery and invention. And so I think one of the things I really like about the essay is that I could go on with many other points, but if we just kind of start with section 1,
Yeah.
I like how he sets up the problem and acknowledges the problem, because again, in 1945, he's basically highlighting that we already have this information overload problem.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to find some other mechanistic ways to deal with it that are going to separate us from the age of print.
Yeah.
And what is that?
Yeah, so that makes sense to me. I think what I struggled with reading this essay is it made me think of a friend I had in college who liked pop music, but he had never really listened to the Beatles. And then one day he went and decided, you know what, I'm going to listen to the Beatles, and he did. And he told me, like, he didn't get it. He's like, I don't understand why the Beatles are important. And there's probably a term for this, but he basically suffered from the artifact effect. The Beatles were so influential that the pop music that he listened to 20, 30 years later was so influenced by the Beatles that when he went back to the source, he had already experienced a lot of the ideas that the Beatles pioneered. But he couldn't contextualize that because he's listening to it after having gone through all these derivative things. And so in reading this essay, I had some of that kind of feeling. Reading this today, I had some real criticisms of the way, for a visionary kind of essay that's intended to inspire and bring people in, he's a sluggish, laborious writer. Like, he's very passive in how he writes. He's very passive voice in how he writes. He writes like a academic, and it's hard to get on board. Now, if I put my head into 1945 and the context of all the other things we talked, who he is and where the world is at, where America is at. And also, people read differently then. I give that grace. Although I did look at the other articles in the Atlantic that month, and this is probably the worst written one of the bunch from my quick review. So I struggled with his ability to inspire me as a reader to care. It takes him a long time. The summary you just gave, Bob, in about 30 seconds is inspiring and tight. We have a problem. Here it is. Boom. And he doesn't really do that. He kind of does it in the corners, but it takes him a lot of mileage of words to get there. And so I struggled with that. I'm like, this is not as an essay, as a form of an essay. And you and I have been reading a lot of essays over the last few months. This is not making my top 20 in terms of his ability to be efficient and to get there fast. Bring me on board fast and take me for a ride. It's slow. He spends a lot of time in the weeds, to me.
So I'm going to push back on a lot of that, Scott. Sorry. It is not academic because he doesn't use jargon. There's like virtually no jargon. This is very accessible to a common person. He's writing in 1945 when we kind of before TV was even popular. He's writing in a very typographic period, right? People are used to reading more detailed things. They're used to taking more time. It's like if you go listen to not that you can listen, but if you imagine the Lincoln Douglas debate, I mean, these guys are talking for hours in very florid prose. and people can get through it. It's a different expectation. So I think you're judging a 1945 essay as a 2026 reader, and I think that's a little unfair. Um, and I agree. Like, it's not nearly as poetic as the Kennedy speech that it's not as motivating as the Kennedy speech I mentioned. But just picking out one sentence, and this is a good representation of maybe some of the issues that you have. The summation, quote, the summation of human experience is being expanded at a prodigious rate, and the means we use for threading through the consequent maze to the momentarily important item is the same as was used in the days of square-rigged ships. Like, I think it's an effective sentence. It's not the most poetic sentence, but I still think it's useful. I'm going to close the door real quick. I'll be right back.
Sure. I can now take over. So Baxley is totally wrong on everything you just said. I am. Oh, hi, Bob. Welcome back.
Yeah.
So this is part of the fun of this, right? Is I highlighted the same sentence.
Oh, wow. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He does have these moments where he writes clearly and effectively and makes a clear argument. It's just buried in a lot of prose. It's a lot of prose. And when I say academic, would I say he uses a lot of jargon? I think that he does. I think he uses a lot of science terms that you and I probably know that are unnecessary. Let's get back to the opening question. Who is he writing for? And I think that he is actually writing for the science community here. It got published in the Atlantic, but he's writing to the scientists. He's writing to the 50,000 scientists that he knew that worked for him, and he knows are out there. He's writing for them. This is a science article. It belonged in like an academic journal. It got published in the Atlantic, and I was trying to poke at like how they decide to do that. I think the answer is just the timing and how important he was in the hierarchy to get him to do this. But it's really reads to me like, and he gets into the weeds on the science, which you can appreciate. I appreciated it too, sort of like we're sort of engineering people, but he gets really precise as if he's trying to give kind of a spec to mechanical engineers. Like he gets really into the details about how these things should work mechanically, which if you're writing a vision essay for the general audience is like that's not. So I think he wrote this really with a different audience in mind than the Atlantic. Thinking of like the average bus driver or the school teacher, did they read it? I don't know.
Shockingly, I'm going to push back again. Like the Atlantic audience is probably a pretty rarefied audience. I don't think it is. This isn't run in a newspaper. This isn't, this isn't the penny press, right? So the Atlantic may be a broad audience, but even today, it's a very erudite group of people that read the Atlantic, right? And maybe the more salient point is that, again, in 1945, science was a big public project. Like we thought about it at a social level. We saw science as a power for good. And we thought about it at this civilizational level in a way that we don't really think about science that way today. We think of science as something that's being done by these nerds in the corner. Yeah. We don't really see it as something that we're going to collectively invest in. But if you go back to the Apollo program, one of my favorite things to talk about, Apollo sucked up more of the federal budget during the 6-7 years that they were doing the program. It sucked up more of the federal budget as a percentage than the defense budget does in the modern federal budget. Like it was a large national project, 400,000 people and some enormous amount of money. And it's very hard to imagine the country today investing in something like that, a science project. We've just sort of turned it over to private enterprise.
Yep.
And so I think it's true. He's trying to galvanize and excite scientists, but I think he's also trying to excite the public about what could happen, and where things could go.
Yeah. I want to follow up on that. But before, we have a few people who are not reading alone. They're here with us. So, hey, folks who are here, Kevin, Bertrand, Andrew, if you guys have a question that you want to throw to Bob or me or both of us, just put a Q in front of it and put it in the chat room, and we will get to it as soon as we see it. The idea of this show, the vision of this show, is that it would be not just a watch Baxley and Berkun argue, although that hopefully is fun, but that we'd have third and fourth opinions come into the room and join the conversation. So if you have a question you want to see us cover, just put it in there. So I was, as you were talking, I was trying to find a section in here that better identifies what I'm talking about in terms of the language and tone, which I admit could be totally irrelevant. I'm looking at 2026 eyes, but I wanted to clarify for you with an example. I do think he is really writing largely for scientists, but here's a paragraph that makes a good point, but he does it in a passive way. He talks about the physicists as if they are a third party. It is the physicists who have been thrown most violently off stride, who have left academic pursuits for the making of strange, destructive gadgets, right? I think he's like worried about what they're going to do next, right? They're going to become the Unabomber? I don't want that, right? Who have had to devise new methods for unanticipated assignments. They've done their part. They. That's passive language. He could be saying if you are a physicist, the passive language is what made my reading ear go, it just tunes you out. And it's not endemic to the time. Academics tend to do this a lot of heretofores and the average man, which just takes, it's just the indirect use of an essay to me. An essay has the power of I and you. And you and I have read so many Montaigne essays, and part of the power of an essay is a person speaking to you as the reader, as if you are a person. And he does a lot of this, a lot of third passive pronoun. Right.
So look, we could spend the whole show rat holing on the style. I'm not sure that's the most interesting use of the conversation, but if we just look at the content, and the sentence that you pointed out, he's talking to physicists, but he's sitting at a higher level. He's not of the physicist community. He is like the physicists are in our world of talking to the physicists would be like if you were a CEO and you're talking to designers, which is like this one function way far down. And you also have to remember, coming out of World War II, there was a lot of people that were very conscious that World War II, featured the chemists who invented napalm and the physicists who invented the nuclear bomb. And it's Malcolm Gladwell has a great, it's the bomb. I think it's called The Bomber Mafia. He had a great podcast about basically the chemist versus the physicist in World War II. And the advent of the nuclear bomb opened up whole new vistas for physics. And there was a lot of stuff that had been discovered in chemistry. And I think he's talking to those communities, not being part of them. It's more like I think he's kind of positioned almost like he's the CEO of Science Inc. in the United States. And he's trying to communicate to these different communities about, what you should go work on now that you're not going to be employed on weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, it's a question I don't know the answer to about, I do know the specific people who became pioneers in tech who referenced this essay, but I don't know who else, I don't know what the effect of it was and how it became something that became such a heavily referenced and revered essay.
Well, as we get deeper into the essay, I think, some of the stuff that stood out for me is he starts to prefigure the idea of hyperlinks, and I think that's one of the most interesting things. That comes a little bit later.
Yep.
That's in section 6. And he's describing how current systems, so in section 6, there's a paragraph, our ineptitude in getting at the record is largely caused by the artificiality of systems of indexing. Mm-hmm. And what he's talking about is how libraries are necessarily organized, that you have to kind of go through the stacks and get to some place in the Dewey Decimal System, and that's where it is. And you're kind of in this specialized thing. But then in the next paragraph, he has what I think is the most important sentence in the entire essay. It's actually 2 sentences, I guess. The human mind does not work that way. It operates by association.
Yeah.
I think that's the key insight. I think the most interesting thing in the entire piece.
Right.
Okay. And I think your critique is going to be, but it comes in section 6. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I think you're being. Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm focused more on the content, and I think you're focused a little bit more on the style.
We can talk more about the structure. Is probably a better place to go. I highlighted the same paragraph. I thought that was great. I thought what I was going to call out, since you and I both are designers or we're in the design world, there's one of the things I really appreciated about this essay, which I think was really unusual, is his habit of thinking like a designer. Like he describes things as like walkthroughs. Like he walks you through how a thing would be used, which is really unheard of. Like, you almost never see engineer sciencey types. He's basically doing like use cases here for the things he's trying to talk about. There was one thing he had about the camera. Let me see if I can find
Yeah,
it.
yeah. That was back in section 2 and section 3
Yeah,
where he's
where he
talking about
talks about the camera, and he's like, he doesn't just say like the camera be like used with one click. He's like, there'd be a cord that would run through to your finger. And then he had a whole thing about basically like Google lenses, right? Where he's thinking about affordances, he's thinking about the human body in a way that surprised me in a very pleasant way. He seemed very thoughtful about how humans operate in the world. And he has probably 4 or 5 examples in here where he spends a lot of time giving detail about how a thing would work from like a user experience perspective, which I was surprised by. I don't remember that. I've never heard anyone call that out about him in the past.
Yeah. I mean, you're kind of going back and talking about what he was describing in section 2 and section 3, where he was imagining, he starts to theorize about dry photography. And I found that section to be particularly interesting because it was indicative of what it means when you get higher up in the science community, how you get to see nascent technologies before they're mass produced. And so we as consumers only see these technologies when they're sort of fully formed and they come out as like a commercial, inkjet printer or something like that. But a lot of these technologies were developed decades and decades before. They were just like these little nascent things. And so when I
Yeah.
think about like, how could Steve Jobs or Jensen Huang, how could they see around the corner of these technologies? Well, they were seeing these nascent things decades before they took off. Right. And so what he actually ends up describing is I believe the technology that becomes Polaroid technology, Polaroid film, and then also electrostatic printing, which is I think what becomes Xerox photocopiers.
Yeah.
So he's seeing that in like 1945, 20 years before it's commercialized. And then to your point, he has this particular use case. And imagine he's going back to the scientist. Imagine the scientist in the lab. And there's actually some illustrations of this, like kind of these nerdy pencil drawings. And this guy's got a camera in the middle of his forehead, like a freaking cyclops, and he's going around taking pictures of stuff with this little button on his hand. You're right. It's a very fascinating thing. He also in that section, he's also talking about microfilm and how microfilm was allowing you to compress the storage of data. And he has a little riff in there where he's talking about imagine taking the entire Encyclopedia Britannica, which today would seem quaint. Like you can't even, the Encyclopedia Britannica would be like a horribly abridged version of Wikipedia.
Yeah.
And you could press it down to something the size of a postage stamp. And then you could reproduce it for like pennies, that like, again, he's sort of theorizing these very pragmatic concerns about how do you deal with all this information and get it more widely distributed so it's available to more people, which again, I just think is like it's not like Gutenberg had some concept of what was going to happen with books, or I mean, mostly the people that invent these technologies, they don't, and he didn't invent the technologies, but I think he plays this secondary role where he saw the technology and he starts to theorize a few use cases of where it could be valuable. And to your point, he paints a very real picture that brings people along and says, oh yeah, that is kind of interesting. I can imagine how you could use that.
Yeah, I would agree with you about the lasting value of what he did here, of talking about this information problem and calling it out ahead of the war's not even over yet. He's thinking ahead about what societal will we like. Yeah. And he repeats the same argument about how all this great information is just buried. And there needs to be a way, we need to build something that will make it so that the best ideas that people have can surface and be used. He's a very optimistic, technocentric view of what progress is. And he was right. He's predicting the information age here. And
he doesn't say this clearly, but now, if I thread a couple of these ideas together, I think he was intuiting that science progresses by making connections between existing information, and that mostly takes the form of association. And I think he was starting to realize that we had so much information now that it was getting harder to make those associations because it was just too laborious and difficult to search through everything. And so I think he was starting to see like, oh, the scientific project could be brought to a screeching halt because the mechanisms by which we make progress are just too challenging, too difficult.
Yeah. The association thing was also a humanistic view of technology. I thought he calls it out in a couple of places that he has this whole thing about trails, and he's basically talking about like annotation and someone can come along and be an editor. Basically, he's talking about editing. Someone can be, curation.
Yeah.
Someone can come along, and the value is how they link the things together. They don't have to be the inventor, but they're showing that's a profound and very humanistic view of technology that is definitely in here. He's really a humanist in his thinking about technology. And I was really surprised by that. That's probably my biggest surprise of the essay, is that despite all my complaints, he inherently understands people and how they work, and has a problem that I think is a user experience kind of problem that he's after, or it's one of the problems he's after.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just got my other highlighted sentence here, which I think actually might be my favorite sentence now I look at it closer. In section 3, he's talking about all these different mechanisms for recording photographs and things like that. And then I'm not exactly sure what the context for this specific sentence, but he's talking about how we've been using punch cards to do arithmetic operations and sort things and filter and things like that. And of course, punch cards have been invented along with the Social Security system, because it was the only way they could process Social Security records. And then punch card systems were critical during World War II for managing all sorts of payroll records and stuff like that. And so he's talking about the mechanical mechanism by how we manipulate certain types of information. But then there's this 2 sentences, quote, "For mature thought, there is no mechanical substitute. But creative thought and essentially repetitive thought are very different things."
Mm-hmm.
And I highlighted that because I think that's the issue that we're struggling with today when we think about Gen AI.
Yeah.
You know, I think a lot of people are really hesitant to use Gen AI. And when I talk to my friends that aren't in tech and I try to describe some of the uses of Gen AI to manipulate data, like I have notes in this format, I need to put them in this different format to move them in Notion. Like they don't necessarily have those use cases, and they wouldn't think about AI in that way. But that's essentially what coding is doing, right? It's like coding is kind of repetitive thought.
Yeah.
And it's just, I think people have a hard time realizing like how much repetitive thought happens in the world and how much Gen AI can help. And then to his point, you know, but creative thought and repetitive thought are very different things.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe the issue people get caught up in, is that when we talk about Gen AI as a replacement for information work or for knowledge workers, we're not separating those 2 lanes.
Yeah.
You know?
So here is a thought that maybe can set us up for the rest of this episode, which is, or question. So we've spent a lot of time debating the value of the essay and the parts we thought were strong or had doubts about. What do you think Bush would think about technology in 2026? So he wrote this in 45, and we're I guess it's almost 80 years later. And a lot of the things that he clearly was defining a vision for, and we've agreed on a bunch of them, about information, about annotation, about creativity. We've agreed on those. How do you think he would look at what happened after? You know, information problem was a problem, but now we're in this age of misinformation. You know, it's something he doesn't anticipate, understandably, I guess. But how do you think he would look at, if you put him in 2026 and sat him down in front of a laptop and walked him through the world today? What do you think he would make of it, based on the ideas in his essay?
Well, I think any of those guys, and you know, Doug Engelbart and Stuart Brand. I mean, Stuart Brand's still alive, but Vannevar Bush, like all these guys, I think they would be absolutely floored by the mechanisms that we have for manipulating information today. You know, I mean, it's like taking the Wright brothers and putting them in front of a 747. Like their brains would explode. So I think that part is pretty obvious. Now, how they would respond to the content of what's going on and how it's been used to manipulate society, I don't think that's something that they were prepared to think about or project upon.
Yeah.
You know, I think you have to get, again, that's why it's so interesting to me to go back to this wrinkle before technology soaked into every corner of society, because there is some of the thinkers, and again, Norman Mailer and oddly Bob Newhart are 2 good examples. They had a certain skepticism about where it could go. And then certainly Neil Postman writing, I think this Technopoly book comes out, and I think that might be the 90s. Certainly,
late 80s, early 90s. Yep.
Yeah, 84 is amusing ourselves to death. I mean, he was a skeptical thinker trying to imagine how things could go off the rails, whereas Bush is, I think, an optimistic thinker trying to imagine the possibilities that technology could open up.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you on that split. I did note it in this essay, and I did some poking around just about Bush's philosophy on things, about how there is a techno idealism in this vision that the way the world will go the right way is by making better technologies, and that any kind of moral, ethical problem is kind of less important than getting the technology right. And like you said, you mentioned Stuart Brand, Tim Berners-Lee, all the people who early web people had the same idea that the technology of democratizing information on its own will just make people better. And they did not anticipate the down parts, the questionable parts of human nature, infighting and in-group fighting and all that. And they didn't anticipate the negative corporate effects of monetizing these things and how that distorts what could be the essentially good parts of technology. Right now with advertising and misinformation and attention economy, we see it now. And Bush didn't see it. I'm not saying I would have seen it either. But in his view of things, it's a very technocentric view of what the future should be. Martin Luther King has a famous quote, which I will butcher here, about, we have technological progress, but we're basically all the other kinds of progress we're ignoring, and that's why we suffer, because we keep thinking once we invent this, we'll be more moral, and it never works. That came to mind as I read this, about the humanities being missing from this, and that a lot of our problems today, I don't think faster information is going to solve it. There's some other way that they would have to be solved. I don't know what that is, but that came to mind for me in reading this about what they would see. They'd be floored. I think they'd be really shocked by how this, I think they might even see it as abuse, like abuse of these inventions that could be used for such amazing things. And they are, but that the mass use of them is for something else.
Yeah, look, I think we have to be careful not to expect too much from any one thinker. You have to look at these thinkers as sort of a web of points of view. And, if I think we'll keep doing this show and keep reading these kinds of essays. I have a list of about 30 essays that go back, I think, to like the 800s with St. Augustine and stuff, where people are wrestling with the impact of technology on humans and on civilization. And I think throughout that collection of essays, there's going to be people that are more on the engineering side, let's build stuff. And then there's going to be people more on the philosophy side that's going to ask what it means. And I don't think it's a question that's going to be resolved by any one person, by any one mind. It's a societal question that, we've been dealing with for a very, very, very long time. And again, there are people that saw around the corner and were focused more about what could go wrong. And Neil Postman, and again, oddly, Bob Newhart are two of those people. But then, there's always going to be people that are excited about what we can make and build. And Vannevar Bush is, understandably from that group, given that he's a scientist.
Yes.
Yep,
I agree with that. And I think it did make me wish, you kind of hope that the technologists want to be more integrators of building things where they're considering how this is very Postman-esque, but to build things with some awareness of what the unintended consequences will be.
No. I don't think the two minds can exist in a single organization or a single person. If we look at the modern world, like OpenAI is clearly not capable of holding at the same time the technology and the social impact. I think Anthropic is trying real hard, but I think they'll ultimately fail. This is why we have government. This is why we have regulations. This is why we have social norms. You need a different organization and a different structure that's balancing the technology. And we just happen to live in a period in time, a very dangerous period in time, where the technology guys are just getting run roughshod. And honestly, you see it in gun control as well. I mean, there's lots of different places where you're going to see this. We've created this enormous amount of technologies that give individuals unprecedented power to do good or to wreak havoc, whether that's through social media, through guns, through AI. There's all these different mechanisms that we've empowered individuals, and we haven't yet developed the social norms or the social institutions, largely through government, to balance those competing interests.
I agree with you about the checks and balances, and that's a healthy way to do it. I do think a person can have both views in their mind. Of course, a person can. I think the system of rewards for entrepreneurs doesn't reward those people, because venture capital doesn't want to hear someone who's not going to launch a feature for an ethical reason. They want the venture capitalist who says there's no ethical problems here. They want the founder who says my vision is perfect. The system of rewards those people. But there's plenty of people who are builders and makers who take on some ethical responsibility and make wonderful things. I don't think it's some limitation of the human mind.
Give me an example.
Well, the person who builds your house. Like
the person who builds my house is operating under so many different governmental regulations and structures and building codes.
I understand that, but they also have the intent of not killing you with what they build. They care about, they have some ethical concerns.
Maybe my house, because that's the social norm, but you go to go to developing countries, and I don't think you're going to see people operating the same way.
The question was not social norm. The question was the capacity for a person to be able to have intellectual or technological ambitions and at the same time have some restraint and recognition of the unintended consequences and design with those in mind. That's just maturity to me. That's a mature designer. They're recognizing the thing they make could harm someone if it was used stupidly. And they're saying, let me think more. Can I make this so that harm is less? I think it's entirely possible. The system of rewards, especially around technology, doesn't reward people for that. I would agree to that. So the open AIs, of course, because there's billions of dollars behind who gets to be chosen to be the CEO or the board of directors. They're not looking for people with ethics. I totally agree with you. And I agree with you systemically. It's better if the checks and balances are operated by people where that's their primary profession to try to keep things continued.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up design, because maybe design is one of those checks and balances. Engineers left to their own devices are going to do what engineers do. They're going to build, right? And they're going to build as efficiently and effectively as possible. And they're not going to think a lot about the downstream effects.
I think it depends on the engineer. I agree. If you want to stereotype that whole profession, sure. They probably want to do that less. That's why they became engineers. But there's plenty of engineers that care. Like Bush, to me, in the way he writes about the how these things would work, has some degree of care about people. He's not just, I'll build it because it's cool. He's like, I'm building it to solve a problem. And the whole spirit of the essay is to solve a problem of, I don't want these engineers building more bombs. like that's like the unspoken motivation here. He's like, I don't want all these scientists to continue to support the war machine. He has a very ethical underlying principle here.
I don't think he minded them building more weapons of mass destruction. I just think he knew that there wasn't going to be as big a market for that. And so he was trying to figure out how to move their energy. So look, one other check and balance that we could have in this is I do think the buying public is going to start making choices about what technology companies they choose to do business with based on their perceived value, both based on their perception of the virtues and values of those companies.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you see this when Elon took over X. And a lot of people come back to it, but there was a point where people kind of abandoned it. And I think the general sentiment against Meta is pretty strong. And I think there's a lot of suspicion around OpenAI because of the behavior of Sam Altman. And so I think there is some social pressure that could bring those companies to think more deeply about the impact of what they're building. But again, that's a check and balance. I think left to their own devices, they're not necessarily thinking that.
I would agree with you that stronger checks and balances is probably the best long-term way to solve this particular problem. I would agree. So we have a couple of comments from our audience. So Andrew offered this: technology is favoring the culture of technologists and entrepreneurs, which is a very narrow future to live in. So I think he's agreeing with you, Bob, about they're going to go what rewards them, and there needs to be some other government. Government's the obvious third wheel.
Or I think social systems as well. I think society as a whole can hold these institutions, these corporate institutions to account in some very meaningful ways. I think ultimately the government should be representative of our social standards. It's not as much as it should be right now, but it should be. And Andrew, I completely agree with you. Like, we live in a time that celebrates technology and entrepreneurs. The United States in particular, we don't even really celebrate scientists or engineers anymore. We celebrate entrepreneurs and celebrities. That's however somebody becomes a celebrity, with those are the things that we celebrate and that we lift up. And it's not surprising that the young generation, everybody wants to be a celebrity entrepreneur. What they make is kind of less a concern than just the fact that they do something at scale that makes them famous and presumably a lot of money.
We do have a question from the audience. It's a slightly different direction, so we can pass on it if we don't like it. But Bertrand, who works as a teacher in academic research, Thinks a lot about how the body. Bush talked about the body of knowledge and how that gets better ways to spread it or share it. His question is, with a body of knowledge no human can master alone, and tools can now navigate it better than we can, what should the new mission of education be? Are we still teaching the right things, or do we need to fundamentally rethink what we're trying to develop in the learner? I can take a quick shot at this and then give it to you, Bob. I think that the educational system, at least in America, has been long hampered by an antiquated idea of what knowledge you need to be a person. And we've had an industrialized idea of education. It was formed mostly in the 1940s. We had industrial workers. And so we're behind even before this wave of AI. Like, we were behind already. And America is so centered on testing, and standardized testing as a way to validate learning. A lot of other countries don't do that. They focus more on the experience students have in the room and the teacher's ability to create an environment where they are interested in learning. So there's some fundamental things, I think, about the philosophy of education at all that were already broken before this. And fixing those things, I think, sets up a better answer to this question. I guess I'm saying there's fundamental things that if you do right, the technology can change and it won't matter, because the system by which you choose teachers and empower them can shift with culture. And you don't need to huge course corrections because there's already a flexible system. And that's not what we have, at least in America.
Yeah, look, I think in a lot of places in the world, what we're teaching is STEM skills, right? And so at a conceptual level in the United States, we don't think about developing citizens, we think about developing consumers. And you saw in the pandemic, in Texas in particular, there were some of the state officials were saying, people just need to take one for the team and keep shopping because your role as a consumer was more important than anything else you could do. And I think the education system, watching my kids go through high school, if you look at the things that we teach them, you're trying to give them scientific skills so that you can make them employable. And the vast majority of kids going to college today, they're taking college classes they think is going to get them a job. They see education as a economic transaction, which completely makes sense given the cost of education in the United States and I think elsewhere. With AI, a lot of the STEM stuff is going to be the first things AI can do because it's more fact-based. It's what we could think of as a complicated problem versus a complex problem, which I could riff on that a little bit here in a second. But I suspect we're going to see liberal arts as a modality of thinking and in a modality of working on these problems become take a bigger role. But there's, I remember being at my kids' orientation for junior high, and a lot of the parents were asking about the math curriculum, and they wanted to know like the whole track, what the math track looked like. And I remember sitting there, it's like, can we see the literature track? Like, I'm just not sure that there's really a literature and a poetry track. Like, people just don't think about reading novels or poetry or anything, or history for that matter. So I just want to make a quick reference to complicated problems versus complex problems, because I think this has unlocked a lot of ideas for me lately. People often think of those two words as being synonyms, but they're not. So a complicated problem is a multivariate problem where there is a known solution, right? Like, once you've solved it, you've solved it. So engineering a bridge is a complicated problem. Engineering a nuclear bomb is a complicated problem. Going to the moon is a complicated problem. There's another class of problems that are complex problems. And complex problems are large-scale multivariate problems where the whole issue is how you balance all the variables, and the specific answer is never really known. So a complex problem would be design, complex problem is government, complex problem is relationships and marriage, right? And they're two very different mindsets. And it's part of what I was making my point about earlier, Scott. I think somebody who's trained to solve complicated problems has a very hard time switching over to solving complex problems. And recently, when I was thinking about Steve Jobs' line about Apple as the intersection of technology and liberal arts, I sort of intuitively knew what that meant, but I didn't really completely understand it. And I think just recently I've realized, what he was trying to say was that Apple as an organization has balanced the ability to solve both complicated problems, the engineering realities, and complex problems, which are the design realities. And there are virtually no other organizations I can identify anywhere in the world who've ever been able to do both of those things at the same time. And I haven't found too many individuals that can move freely between, and there's a few, but not too many that can move freely between that. And I think that tension between those two problem-solving methodologies, those two mindsets, is what makes it so hard to be a designer in a tech company. It makes it so hard to be a philosopher in a STEM-based society like the United States. I suspect very much like China. I suspect like India. I suspect like China. Most of the world right now is very STEM oriented, and AI is going to challenge all that because the STEM thinking is the thing that AI is going to be most capable of addressing. Why are you laughing?
I don't know. I just find the whole human spectacle entertaining in a way, like in a Voltaire kind of way of like, we spent so much time, at least in America, pushing everything to STEM, 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 like STEM's the way to have a profession, have a job. And then it's like, oops, like, whoops, sorry. Like, we were wrong. Now,
well, you don't have to go back to 1945. Go back to 1920. Or I'm sorry, go back to 2020, and you would have told every kid in your orbit to go study computer science.
Of course, yeah.
And here we are 6 years later, and they're struggling to find jobs.
Yeah, and I'm not laughing that I could have been any smarter or forecasted anything. It's just there's a human folly element to all of this, that we underestimate how much things can change and overestimate our ability to predict things. We have to feel confident to do things. But that's why I was laughing. It's like, I agree with you, but it's like, it's so hard to get some of these things right. How do you bet the future of a society's educational system and feel confident you're going to do it right? It's just really, really hard.
So, Andrew, I see your STEAM thing. That was something that John Maeda talked a lot about. I sort of have this joke that, we spent all this time talking about STEM education, and STEM is the part of the plant we don't eat. And then we got excited about steam, and I'm like, okay, well, steam is a 19th century technology we use to power the railroads. What I want is dream jobs, where DREAM is an acronym for design, reading and writing, engineering, arts, and mathematics. Because in none of these acronyms do we talk about design, which is actually, again, sort of the ability to solve complex problems, nor do we talk about reading and writing, which seem really freaking important to me, but they somehow don't make it into any of these acronyms.
Yeah.
And honestly, just selfishly, I think DREAM's a much better acronym than STEAM or STEM. So, yeah.
Well, speaking of dreams, this might be a good point to close the show. Do you have any final thoughts about Bush, or as you may think? This Bush, not other Bushes.
Yeah, I got it. Look, I in section 7, I had this other highlighted sentence that I just think is interesting. He's talking, he's relating a story about a friend who was talking about a certain, I can't remember the whole context, but it was like another society that was having trouble with, adopting some technology. And he has this, the highlighted phrase is, quote, "the queer ways in which a people resist innovations, even of vital interest."
Yep.
And I just thought, like, yeah, that's like, that was still going on in 1945. Like, these new technologies come out and people are really skeptical about them. And I think we have to be careful about AI, but I don't think you could be, we're not turning back that tide. Like, it's here and it's happening. And I'm always very frustrated with people that don't approach it with at least a sense of curiosity. I don't know if you have to have a sense of optimism about it, but I think you've got to find some way to engage in it, because it's not going away. And I don't think you can bury your head in the sand and be like a internet Amish person and just avoid it. It is an invasive species of an alien intelligence that we've invited into our world, and it's here to stay. So if you're somebody who's skeptical of it, it means that you're probably a thinker. And if you're a thinker, you may be the most important people in society for engaging in it, because you may be the very person that can help us direct in a positive way. So I hope people can kind of set aside their skepticism and their cynicism and kind of realize it's here, and try to help figure out how to make it a force for good and help us build that social tissue to be that check and balance on it.
Yeah.
Because if we just leave it to the engineers, we are just so totally screwed.
Well, we're leaving it to the engineers and the venture capitalists. What a great partnership for the future.
Yeah, if you leave it to the capitalists.
Great.
Yeah, if you leave anything to the capitalists, it's, and look, all these people are incented. We could argue about whether or not they're moral actors, but they're incented by society in certain ways. So
yeah. The quote that for me could close this out is, I loved how he talked about trails and this view of, I used the word curator before, but someone who's got more perspective, and how important that is. The new profession of trailblazers, he calls it. Those who find delight in the task of establishing useful trails through the mass of the common record. And that's a phrase I really liked. I like that whole sentence. Beautiful. It's like motivating and inspiring. Enormous mass fits how I think about the information world at times. Like, we've done a lot of things Bush wanted us to do. It's still a massive, like, juggernaut of chaos and messiness. But the trailblazer thing, like, that means someone has a way out. They're making a trail to go somewhere. And that's the thing that I feel my critique of all the technologists, including Bush, all the people who are like, the technology will save us, is they never really tell us where it goes, as like in a liberal artsy humanities way of how is this going to make things better? How is it going to make me more fulfilled? How is it going to make people who are impoverished have more means? How, like, all the liberally kind of goals for humanity, that's the trail that I care about the most. And if a technology can help us get there, I'm excited about it. But a technology that's just a better technology, I kind of lose interest. And AI, for me, I find it fascinating. It's amazing. But these conversations often go towards like productivity. When I make more things, I'm like, I don't know that improves the human condition. It might. And that's where I go in all of this. How is this going to improve the human condition? Yes, it's faster. Yes, we have more data. Minimizing data storage. Great. How is it going to improve the human condition? We're making it better. And that gets so easily lost in these conversations. And that's really where my heart goes. That's always where my heart went, why I wanted to get involved in building shit to begin with. I wanted to make things better for somebody.
Look, I think there are a lot of useful voices out there as technology critics. They're not nearly as loud as the capitalists or the engineers, but they are out there. And those are the people that I hope we're going to be reading and talking about in the coming weeks. You know, I'll say, kind of as we wrap things up here a little bit, Scott and I have been sort of positioning this in our own minds as like a pilot of this thing. We're not entirely sure if this is a project that has legs, but this was fun. I'm really glad people showed up. Looks like we got a handful of folks, which was frankly a handful more than we thought we might get. So I appreciate all you guys showing up, and I recognize a lot of the names. If you have any feedback or comments for us, like, I think all of you know how to get to us either on email or through LinkedIn. So if you have some thoughts on what else we could do with the show, I hope you'll reach out and let us know. We're going to debrief after this. I'm pretty sure we'll be back in a couple of weeks with something else, but we'll see.
Thank you all for tuning in. And what Bob said is totally true. You're here. You gave us some of your time. Give us the benefit of what you thought and what could be better, or what you would like to suggest that we do, so you'd want to come back. Yeah, but let's sign off. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Vannevar Bush. Just got to say his name right, for writing this essay 80 years ago. It still lives on, the power of writing. And thank you, Mr. Baxley, for doing this little experiment with me.
Thank you, Mr. Berkun.
All right.
Berkun. Yeah.
Bye,
See you
everybody.
guys. Bye.